Welcome back to World War II TV. It seems to be a marathon around. There was 2 shows yesterday, 1 today, or 3 today if we're in Australia or New Zealand. Anyway, it's fair to say that the war in the Pacific is largely written from the point of view of the victors. Barely 50,000 Japanese combatants surrendered at the end, and yet there were 6 million in the army alone. Peter Williams joins us to talk about his interviewing of some of these survivors. It's all based on his fantastic book, which I'm holding up there, Japan's Pacific War, personal accounts from the campaign. So I'll bring him in now. Good evening, Peter. How are you?
Good, Paul. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being back. So the process of interviewing Japanese veterans must have been totally different in many ways to the fact you spoke to many Australian veterans. And firstly, the fact you did it in Japan, whereas I'm guessing most Australian veterans you spoke to in Australia. So take us back to how and why you wanted to start speaking to the veterans, whether or not you kind of set up a way of doing it in advance, or whether your methodology kind of developed as you went on. Take us through the basics.
I started teaching English in Japan in 1984, and I had a seniors class, retired adults, who were doing it for a hobby. And one of them, Yukiko, she told me that she had been a waitress for kamikaze pilots when they were having their final party before they went off to join their squadrons. And it just so happened that the school I was teaching in was a part of an old hotel, and the other unused part of the hotel was where these kamikaze pilots had their party. So she took me down after class and showed me this room where the pilots would get drunk and shout bonsai and walk out, and she'd never see them again. And it sort of got me thinking about the town. I realized, I mean, I already knew that the guy who cut my hair had served in the Imperial Japanese Navy, and the postman's dad had been in the army. And I just started to think about it, and I sort of thought I wanted to talk to these people. So I went with pen and paper first to interview them, and my Japanese was hopeless at that time. I would take friends along, and it sort of grew from there. And within a few years, I'm traveling around the country, finding veterans, and my Japanese friends are finding veterans for me to interview.
I mean, it's amazing, and I think one of the things that we want to ask you is, being British and as Americans watching us Australians, we're used to the idea of the fact that post-war veterans organizations were established. And okay, lots of veterans didn't join them, but lots of them did. Did Japan have that kind of culture of these guys openly meeting up with each other, or was it something they generally kind of just put away as Japan focuses on kind of reinventing itself as a country? Do they have veterans organizations?
Yes, it's just the same as you see in any Western country, or it was when there were veterans. With one exception, that if you'd been a prisoner of war, you didn't go to your regimental association meeting. There was too much shame attached to that. If you'd come back from prisoner of war camp, you just kept away. You might even move to another town, so people generally didn't know that you'd been a prisoner of war. But you certainly wouldn't show up at your unit's association meetings.
Right. Well, we'll bring up some of the individuals you interviewed with slides in a minute, but you said it sort of started off almost informally. The guy cutting your hair was Did you go in?
Sorry.
Did you go into the first one with a kind of an idea of what sort of questions you were going to ask? Were they coming to you on the time? Did you let them speak and then you kind of join in? How did those first couple go?
Well, I didn't know rule number 1 about interviewing people, and that is to shut up and let them talk. So I did too much talking, but I learned to keep quiet after a while and let them talk, and initially writing down as much as I could of what they'd say, but I could only do that if I had one of my Japanese friends with me. And then later I could tape it. It was a very messy thing at the start, and I didn't know why I was doing it. And the book came along 40 years after the first interview. I didn't really know why I was interviewing them in those first few years, and I began to get this idea I should interview as many veterans as I can, because soon they won't be around.
Well, exactly. I mean, we say that all the time about Allied veterans. That they won't be around forever, and they're a finite resource, and even more so in the case of the Japanese, because, as I said at the top of the show, so few, comparatively speaking, survived the war. This is maybe an odd question, but veterans are veterans in many ways, whether they're from New Zealand, Australia, Britain, Canada. There's a sort of a mentality about veterans. At the end of this process, did you feel that, broadly speaking, Japanese veterans had the same way of responding than Australian veterans, or was there something very different? Because we always thought the stereotype is the Japanese culture is imperceptible to Westerners, everything is completely different. But do you think, broadly speaking, the veterans were the same?
No, broadly speaking, no. I think there's some fundamental differences in the way they approach these things. Yeah, trying to think of a good example.
Yeah, please do.
Well, yeah, Western veterans would say, I really tried to. I realised I might die in the war, but I really hoped I would survive. A Japanese veteran typically might say, well, when I signed my life over to the emperor, I was supposed to die in the war, and I didn't. It was kind of a surprise, and the war suddenly ended, and I wasn't dead, because that was the plan. That's what I was supposed to do. Yeah, well, that's one example.
I mean, that alone is fascinating, because, you know, I remember having a slightly, not heated, but strong argument with an American veteran, Don Burgett of the 101st Airborne, when we were going to one of the cemeteries somewhere, and he was saying, do you say, Paul, because of being a talker, do you say these guys gave their lives? And I said, well, I think I have used that expression. He said, no. He said, these men here gave their service and their lives were violently taken away from them. Now, what you're saying is the Japanese understood that they were going to be giving their lives, and surviving was the last thing they were expecting. That's a very different mindset.
Right, but you weren't supposed to. In Bushido, one of the ideas is you don't die uselessly. That's a dumb thing to do. The smart move is you die usefully. Like you take 5 of them with you when you go. That's a useful death. That's what you're supposed to do.
Well, we'll bring up the individuals you spoke to in a minute, but one last kind of broad question before we get going is, you know, again, with the lack of Japanese survivors, clearly there were certain campaigns where there weren't going to be many survivors from. You know, I'm thinking immediately of Okinawa and Iwo Jima, perhaps. But so when you spoke to people from the different campaigns, were they from particular campaigns that seemed to have survived? Was it a broad sweep? What tell us kind of what areas you spoke to?
I started out wanting to interview a few veterans from each of campaign where they'd fought against Australians, but it soon got bigger than that, and I found that some of the men had other such interesting experiences in other campaigns that I interviewed them about that too. I did find an Iwo Jima survivor. Yeah, he was a pusher-outer in a transport aircraft, and he'd go into Iwo Jima once a week, and they'd deliver the mail. And one day when they got there, they landed, and the plane wouldn't work anymore. And the next thing you know, somebody walks up to him and gave him a rifle and said, "You're in the army now."
Wow.
So he became part of the garrison of Iwo Jima. But he managed to surrender later and survived.
Okay, well, we'll bring up the photos now, and then we can go through the individuals and what you learned from them. And there's a couple of things. Obviously, the elephant in the room when it comes to Japanese is atrocities, some of those darker aspects, you know, and also as an Australian, as a Brit, you know, our sort of shared connection in terms of our countries is the Thai-Burma railway and the graphic brutality that was happening out there. That was obviously something you would want to know about. When you started bringing up the darker side of things, did they start clamming up? Did they change the subject? I know, again, it's a sweeping statement, but what were your first impressions?
Well, first of all, I never found anyone who was on the Burma Railway or something like that who was willing to be interviewed. There's a certain class of Japanese veteran that is not going to speak to anybody about what they did. They know what they did was not a good thing, and they won't be interviewed. So that's difficult. But I did have one fellow who took part in, well, perhaps I should read something to you.
Yeah, please do.
This is in Singapore. This is Real Zokawate. And he said, in Singapore, I had to execute hostile local civilians. Around 50 of them, all aged in their 20s or 30s, were taken by the military police, and we, the privates, were ordered to bayonet 2 of them each. Those men, mostly Chinese guerrilla suspects, were quite impressive. They didn't beg for their lives, scream, or anything like that. They just looked at us in silence. The one I had to kill was probably aged 30. He behaved the same as the others. When I stabbed him with my bayonet, my hands were shaking badly because I was afraid. I still remember that fear even now. He fell into a hole prepared for them. The other one I had to kill was a black man. I don't know where he was from or what he was doing in Singapore. Unlike those Chinese, he cried, begged, and asked us for help. We tied him up, but somehow he got loose and ran around. I had to chase after him, jump on him, and bayonet him in a puddle of muddy water. You never forget such a thing.
Wow. Wow. And, you know, we're going into the kind of psychology of speaking to veterans. Is that, did you feel that him telling you that was part of a cathartic process? Had you think he'd spoken about that before?
I know it took a long time. I know that one of the tricks was to go and visit a veteran several times. And the first time you would hear something a bit bland, and possibly the second or the third time you would get a story like that. I mean, once he felt confident.
It's establishing the trust. Genuine, yeah. I mean, we were just saying before going live, I wish I'd known at the beginning of starting to speak to veterans what I learned during the process over the 30 years of doing it, because I would have gone about things in a very different way. And, you know, I trod on nerves a few times because I brought up a subject too early in the knowing of the veteran. Other times I felt that I had earned the trust, and I didn't bring up things I wish I had. But let's bring up some of the photos of people you talked about, and we'll look at them. So we'll go kind of through them one by one, and then your recollections.
All right. Well, this is Sadashiga Imanishi. He was a rice farmer in Shikoku, up in the mountains of Shikoku, and he became the mayor of the town after the war. But he was a fellow I went to see probably 4 times. He was a wonderful interview, and I'd just like to read some general comment he made about his time in the war.
Please do.
You do what you must in the time when you're born. I felt it was my destiny at that time to fight and win to protect my hometown and my family. If you're born in a certain time, you're a victim of that time. I was born in time to be an adult in a war. He says about the army, he says, by 1942, by the time we retreated from Port Moresby, I was pretty sick of it all. I felt I'd done my share. I was conscripted in 36. I thought I'd do my 2 years and return home. But I was in China 3 years and ended up doing 9 years in the army. 38, I came back from China. I was a corporal at that time, but I'd decided I didn't like the military life, and most of my friends I'd left with were dead. I'd landed on the beach at Shanghai and been in all the battles. I was fed up with the war and had an opportunity to get out of the army. I took it. I quit to return to farming. But then in February 41, I was advised I'd be called up again. I didn't want to go back to war, but the principal of the school and the town mayor came and told me I must go. I had an offer for an arranged marriage too, but I didn't want to take it till I came back. The postman came to our house with the order to report in. I thought he was bringing something else until he said, "Imanishi-san, here it comes."
Wow.
It's interesting there that he talks about the mayor and other people telling him he really must go to the army. He can't try and weasel out of it. This is a difference I should have mentioned. I didn't think of before, that the collectivism versus individualism. We, in the West, we think more that people can make their individual choice. But Imanishi's village thought that they could tell him what to do. I mean, they argue that it's because they care about him. But Westerners might see it as interfering in your own business. That cropped up a bit. People telling people, you should join the army, you know, the country's peril, you should join up. In a way, what we might think, a Westerner might think, well, I'll make up my own mind, thanks very much. But a Japanese would feel, gee, the village thinks I should do it, I'm going to have to do it.
Well, it brings up a question I'm going to have is, you said that, you know, your Japanese wasn't very good at the beginning. Obviously, it got better by the end because you were living there. Were you able to sense the tonal shifts? I mean, I don't understand how the Japanese language works, but for example, when I'm looking at a clip of a veteran who has been exposed as being a bit of a Walter Mitty, a bit of a fraud, and you know, they were claiming they were at things they weren't, I'll notice that often when it's the true bits, they were saying I was recruited in 1941. But then when they're going into the bit where they're being a bit free and loose with the truth. They say we a lot. So the unit went in, we were fighting there. So were you able to kind of detect any kind of tonal shifts or grammar shifts when the veterans you were speaking to kind of moved from generalisms to what they themselves did?
No, I can't really say I could do that. No, I certainly have had that experience with Western veterans I've interviewed, feeling that one in particular I can think of, feeling that I'm interviewing a fraud, but I couldn't detect that with any of the Japanese.
And I guess, you know, as I do living in France, when I'm listening to a conversation in French, I have to use body language to fill in the little bits that my brain doesn't keep up with. There's a word I don't understand. So the body language when you're interviewing the Japanese vets, I'm guessing that was also helping you fill in the gaps, and whether they got out photo albums or whether they smiled or whether they looked kind of stern. You're reading that themselves as well.
As much as I can, and I'm trying to apply everything I've learned about how to be polite to Japanese when I go into the house, and often I blunder in the early days, but I got better.
Yeah. Well, any more to say about this gentleman?
No, we can go on to
okay.
Harada. Harada was a fighter pilot from Nagoya. He died in 2016, and he shot down 19 aircraft during the war. Though the Japanese, some of the pilots didn't keep a personal score at all. Harada himself would be likely to say, if you asked him, you know, what was your contribution to the war? How many planes did you shoot down? And he said, I contributed to shooting down 157 planes. And he means that's the squadron score. He'd be more likely to say that. But other people have done the work, and Harada is credited with 19.
But that's interesting again, because that connects that collectivism you were talking about in the first chap, the village saying you ought to go and join again, and in this case he's talking about what the unit's contribution was as opposed to his own. This is really interesting. I mean I think everybody watching this right now, they're going through the same process I am, although I've read most of the book, is that the art of dealing with people is kind of consistent, but understanding what these Japanese veterans went through is very different, if that isn't a sort of mixed message there. But yeah, back to you.
Well, he talks about being a fighter pilot a little bit, something I could read out.
Yep.
To shoot down a plane, you have to get very close. If your target is more than 200 meters away, you won't hit it. You really want to be 100 meters away, right behind his tail. Then get in even closer before you turn away, or you'll crash straight into him. You often see the enemy pilot's face, perhaps suffering in pain, in a blazing cockpit. You see that face whether you like it or not. Sometimes I saw the enemy's cockpit all red, splattered in blood. That tells you how close I got. I remember those faces. They wanted to live, to be with their families back home, but were in pain as they stared into the abyss. For some years after the war, I had bad nightmares about it. My wife had to wake me up.
Wow. And yeah, that's universal. That could be those experiences. That could be a British pilot, an American pilot.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. That could be anybody. Yeah, it contrasts with another fellow, Tsunoda, another fighter pilot, because he went on at length about how he never did feel there was a body in the other plane. From him, it was just a plane. I was just shooting down a plane, and he would describe it that way. It was just a piece of machinery that I was shooting down. I never thought about the people inside it. But Harada's got quite a different view, as he just expressed.
And yet again, we hear the same kind of things with Allied pilots. You know, I've heard that some bomber crews always talking about it being targets and cities, and the others were always thinking about the fact they were dropping bombs on human beings. It's that's how human beings react to a situation, and I'm kind of adding the fact that whether you're Japanese, British, or American doesn't necessarily change the human responses. We Westerners watching this, because of movies, because of comics, we have an idea about the Japanese way of waging war that is partly based on reality and partly based on banzai charges in comics. And what you're saying to us is really, really revealing. I'm finding this incredibly fascinating, Peter. Thank you very much. Have we finished on Harada, or should we move on?
We could go on to Nishimura, the next guy. Yeah, this is Kokichi Nishimura. He's called the Bone Man of Kokoda. He fought on Kokoda track. He called the Bone Man because he went back after the war and he lived in Popondetta for 15 years or so, I think, and he was looking for the bones of his comrades. I mean, 100,000 Japanese died in New Guinea in World War II, and many thousands, possibly most of those bodies, have never been found. And Nishimura went back to find the bodies of his unit. He talks about hand-to-hand combat with an Australian soldier at Brigade Hill on the Kokoda track. If you'd like to hear that one.
Yes, please.
Yeah, right. Brigade Hill was the first time I found myself in a hand-to-hand combat. I had a moment when I fixed my eyes on my enemy, where I realised what I was doing was absolutely insane, without any sense or reason. I wondered, why do we have to kill each other? He hasn't done anything wrong. I have no malice toward him, but if I don't kill him, he'll kill me. It just didn't feel right at all, but I couldn't disobey my orders. I was trained and brainwashed to kill the enemy, no matter what. But these questions were going through my mind. It was during this attack I bayoneted the Australian. There was no stepping back. The fighting was toe-to-toe. Anyway, in the Japanese army, if you turned to run, you'd be shot by your own men. The Australians, hundreds of them, came at us. I saw a man heading for me. It was too late when I realised it. The next thing I knew, he shot me with his submachine gun. Bullets whizzed by my head and some entered my shoulder. I thought that was the end of my life, but I couldn't just die without doing anything, so I went for him. The Australian looked at me in surprise. His face was so young. He must have been a mere boy, but he was tall and my head only reached his shoulders. I went for him with my bayonet and he grabbed it and held on. He gave me a kick and I fell back. I went at him again, got hold of his knife or bayonet, something like that, and stabbed him with it. He screamed and fell down. It looked like he was done for. Then I became dizzy as I was bleeding badly. I sat down, ready to finish him off if he moved, but he didn't. Then I passed out. When I awoke, the fighting was over and he was dead beside me.
Wow. Incredible. And on a personal level, Peter, you know, you've written extensively about Kokoda and New Guinea and, you know, and you're proud Australian. How was it? Did you have to kind of switch off your own emotions to sitting with a Japanese, you know, an enemy soldier telling you about this? Was it difficult?
Certainly. Yeah, I tried to take a neutral position. Yeah, I think I was reasonably successful in that.
Mm. And while we're on the subject of New Guinea, another elephant in the room is the fact, so often on this channel we talk about, as the Japanese are losing the war, supplies becomes an issue. They can't feed themselves and things like that, and cannibalism. It's talked about a lot. How much truth there is in it, what people spoke about it. Did you bring that up with veterans?
I brought it up with Nishimura here, this man. He had something to say about it. I'll read it. He was at Buna. This was at the end of the Kokoda campaign, and the Japanese who've invaded Papua, they're being forced back to their beachhead and they're being wiped out in the beachhead. And this is a case where they've run out of food. No supplies can come in by sea. There was no food at all there. So at Buna, soldiers started to eat human flesh. If you wanted to stay alive, that's what you did. At first, we shot enemy soldiers and crawled out to drag in their bodies and check their pockets of food. We'd eat that and it would keep us going. But after a while, they didn't seem to be carrying any food on them, so there was no other way to survive but to eat them. We'd cut slices off and cook it. Any Japanese who was in the front line at Buna and is alive today and says they did not eat human flesh is telling a lie. There was no other way to stay alive.
Wow. I mean, hold the phone, to use a young expression. That's just amazing history, isn't it? I mean, that brings down to just how war reduces people to just the most base subhuman level of this. And again, I don't know where I'm going with these questions, but you know, the Japanese mentality, we have this idea that they're serving the emperor, they're giving their lives. When they're on their knees like this, eating human flesh to survive, did you feel they were still fighting for the emperor? Are they fighting individually? Does unit cohesion, you know, allies will often talk about, you know, you die for the man beside you as opposed to dying for a larger cause. Did the Japanese mentality stay to fighting for the emperor, or do you think it reduced?
People said different things. Like one fellow said that when another soldier was going to shoot himself, going to commit suicide rather than be captured, that he shouted out, "Long live the emperor," and then shot himself. But the fellow I was talking to said, but that was just for show. That was rubbish, that he didn't really care about the emperor. So some people have that view, but others said, no, others wrote in their diaries and or told me that they were in it for the emperor. They were serious about this. They were protecting their home and family and their culture, their nation. They were keen to do that, most people.
Extraordinary. Well, if we're finished with Nishimura, we'll move on.
Oh, yeah, I think.
Oh, no, unless you want to say something else.
Oh, no, that's fine. No, that's fine. This is Takaro Tsuzuku. He became a chemistry professor after the war, and he worked in the United States for a number of years. But he was in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He was an officer, and he was on the Yamato, the battleship, and at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and at Leyte Gulf. But he was transferred before the Yamato was sunk. But that's not the bit I was going to talk about. He talks about the Etajima Naval Academy, about his training there, and he said it was one of the three premier naval academies of the world in the early 1940s when he was there, and that's Dartmouth and Annapolis and Etajima. And he says things like, we did everything just the way the Royal Navy did them. In fact, they brought the cloth for their uniforms. They brought it from the United Kingdom. And he's just got a few interesting things to say about how things were in training at the Naval Academy. We did things just the way the Royal Navy did them. We were not supposed to wash our own clothes. We had laundrymen for that. Etajima gave us 36 pairs of socks, and once they were worn, we had to throw a pair away instead of fixing them. Senior students told us not to be like an ordinary man who patches his worn clothes. We also received 7 white shirts and again had laundrymen to wash them, even if we'd only worn them for a few hours. We were trained how to eat a full-course Western meal. Before graduation, our manners were tested by attending a dinner party with the principal and other high-ranking officers. We also learned how to behave at a party. We were told to stand by the right side of a lady and offer her our left arm to go into dinner. We did horse riding and various other things that English gentlemen did. By the time we graduated, we came to think that we'd become an elite. It was a snobbish society, but it was a very interesting one too. Yeah, I liked his description of Etajima, of that officer class in Japan, and that elite naval officer class.
No, definitely, and it kind of reveals an aspect that we don't think of. Again, we think of this, the words we use, the Bushido code, this warlike, and yet in some ways he just wants to be, or there's a perception of wanting to be seen as sophisticated and classy. Yes,
and particularly that that Japanese naval officers model themselves after the Royal Navy. Suzuku also told me that he was quite pleased when he heard that war had broken out, because he's a professional naval officer. He wants to ply his trade, but he was very disappointed to learn he might be fighting the Royal Navy, that the Royal Navy was one of the enemies. They really admired the Royal Navy, and as they said, they modelled themselves on it. And I thought that was interesting too.
It's absolutely fascinating. Yeah, we'll keep on moving. This is just truly amazing stuff, Peter.
Minoru Honda, another fighter pilot. He was the last surviving Imperial Japanese Navy ace. He died 2 years ago, aged 98, and he became a test pilot after the war, and he flew Sabre jets, and he also did that in the USA. He was in Texas for a couple of years doing some kind of test pilot's work. And he told me a story about Guadalcanal. On the way back to Rabaul from Guadalcanal one day, they'd been to Guadalcanal to strafe the runway or something like that. I found a Zero fighter flying low ahead of me near Munda Island. It was one of my friends, Sergeant Nakajima. His plane was hit somewhere and was declining in altitude. He made an emergency landing in the ocean and started swimming towards Munda. Then I saw dozens of sharks were heading toward him. I was astonished, and I dived and started shooting up the sharks. After I fired one burst, I flew past them, turned around to go again, but Nakajima had disappeared. Decades after the war, he appeared in front of me on a street in Japan, large as life. He told me he had reached the island, was rescued by the local people, was handed over to the Americans, stayed a prisoner till the end of the war. He said the sharks that I'd machine gunned were really dolphins. That's it. Yeah, he knew he was leading up to that point. He was sort of like telling, Honda likes to tell a story, and he knew he was leading me up to, you know, sharks that actually had machine gun dolphins. He thought that was very funny.
And again, I'm just thinking that I know these people you're interviewing are Japanese because I'm seeing the name, I'm seeing their faces. But if I heard that story, it sounds just like one American vet would say, or a British vet would say, that sometimes the accounts of cannibalism that's alien to anything I've ever heard in my life. But these accounts, again, the universal is the word that's coming to mind.
You're right.
Yeah,
you're right.
Really
well, actually, you might be struck by the next one then. Where has he got? Oh, no, actually, next we have something different. That's Masao Fourier. He was the last survivor. He was 30 years old when the war ended, and he died in 22, aged 106. And that's him on the right-hand side of that line of Japanese officers there. That's their surrender. That's the 18th Army surrendering to the Australians at Cape One in September 1945. And Fourier was at the surrender ceremony with General Adachi, the 18th Army commander. But he has he's got a more, well, I'll read his view about the war, Fourier's view. He's talking about the end of the war now, though, about August 1945, when the 18th Army's on its last legs, really. The 18th Army's new plan was the Honourable Death Plan, to be executed at the end of September 1945. Because we had little food and ammunition, we couldn't last much longer. We were going to end it honourably in death. I was sent to Sepik River to prepare that part of the overall plan. Then an order arrived for me immediately to return to headquarters. When I arrived, I heard we'd been defeated. While in New Guinea, I'd been writing poems. I wrote one then, concerned with my fears for what would happen to our nation in the future. That was the last poem I ever wrote. Japan was defeated, but the mainland had not been invaded. It was as if the war was not really finished. Is that the right way to end a war? The Japanese people would rather stand until they fall, completely vanquished. That's the spirit we had. I expect it to you. It's a strange way of thinking. And Fourier still, to his dying day, he was regretful that Japan surrendered. He thought they should have fought on.
Wow. Even after 2 atomic bombs.
That was his position. Yes. Wow.
That's extraordinary stuff. I mean, this is one of the most spine-tingling shows I've hosted for some time, Peter. So, yeah, we'll crack on. Amazing stuff.
Yeah. Now, this is one that you might think any Western officer could say. This is Okamoto. When I was started to think I might really do a book of interviews, I realised that I hadn't spoken to many senior officers, and by that time they were starting to become thin on the ground. But Masao Fourier, the guy we were looking at just before, he was the head of the Repose of the Souls of the War Dead Association, and he had a lot of clout. And he would he'd just tell people, this gaijin, this foreigner's coming, and he's going to interview you, so you show up. And Colonel Okamoto here was one of the people who was, I think, told to show up and be interviewed. And he gave a great interview. But what I like is his final little speech to his men at the end of the war. When I heard about the end of the war, I was still in New Guinea, commanding what was left of my battalion. Honestly, I was relieved. The ordeal I had not asked for was at last over. I called my battalion together to speak to them. As the commander, you feel responsible for the men. It was difficult to find the words I needed. I told my men that Japan had been defeated, but they should not be discouraged, as they had fought well. They should go home to their loved ones and live their lives. Like that. Now that, as you pointed out before, that any soldier from any nation could say exactly that. Yeah.
That immediately reminds me of, and you'll know the guy's name, the officer who gave that speech towards the end of the Kokoda campaign. I can't think of he was. Yeah. That's a universal concept. That's a universal concept that he loves his men. He's got a bond with his men. They've done what they're supposed to do. They've performed admirably. Go home and survive. You're taking me all over the shop with my emotions today, Peter, which is which I guess is what the book does. And we're all, again, I've said it before, we're guilty of kind of putting one image of a Japanese combatant in our heads, and you're showing us that they are as individual in how they see the war as Westerners. Incredible stuff. Anything else from him?
No, that's all right.
Brilliant stuff.
This is another smooth-looking fighter pilot, Katsuyoshi Yoshida. The fighter pilots have some great stories. I've got probably more fighter pilots than I should have in this, but look at him, cheeky little devil on the left. This is Yoshida. He shot down. He was a Navy fighter pilot. He shot down 10 planes in the war. He's gone now, but he'd be 101 if he was still alive. And he describes his first combat experience, which was over Darwin in Australia. And there were 20 Zeros escorting 27 bombers to bomb the harbour facilities, and that all goes smoothly, and they're turning around and they're going for home thinking that that's it. That was an easy one, didn't see anything. After the bombers dropped their bombs over Darwin, we turned away and we were on our way back to Kupang on Timor. Then suddenly, from behind at about 5 o'clock high, Australian Spitfires dived at us and shot down Tajiri, who'd graduated from the same training squadron as I did. He was always a big eater, and I suspect he was eating his lunch in his cockpit when he got shot down. That's why I didn't spot the Spitfire's attack. I saw the Spitfire that shot down my friend fly straight across in front of me. I turned left and chased after it and shot it and hit it, and before it dived to get away from me. I could see my bullets hitting it and starting to leak fuel, but I couldn't tell if I shot it down or not. Later, one of the senior pilots told me I had shot it down. As he saw the pilot pop out of the plane, he watched the Spitfire pilot for a while and thought the parachute didn't ever open. I thought the Spitfire was such a beautiful fighter plane, I almost felt I shouldn't shoot one down. It was a guilty feeling to aim, press on the trigger, and watch pieces come off it. That's it. Except I've been able to work out who that Spitfire pilot was. The only fellow that fits the circumstances is Sergeant Albert Cooper. Now, there was a Spitfire wing in Darwin in 1943, and one of the squadrons was an RAF squadron, and Sergeant Albert Cooper's from Wolverhampton. And it looks like what happened is he bailed out, hit his head on the tailplane, didn't ever open his parachute. Him and his plane fell into Darwin Harbour, and they've never been found. But that's who he shot down. That's who Yoshida shot down.
Incredible stuff. Moving on still?
Yeah. Let's go to Taro Mori, who was in the Java Sea. He just describes what he's doing at the Battle of the Java Sea when a Japanese force met the American, Australian, British, and Dutch ships in the Allied force. My job in battle was to carry shells to any gun that needed them. In that battle, I ran all around the ship. One moment I'd be on deck watching enemy shells landing near us, making water splashes 5 meters high. The next moment, I'd be below getting another shell. I was running around delivering shells, trying not to gawk at the enemy ships on the horizon. There were flashes from their guns and clumps of black smoke. I didn't look around as much as I wanted, as I knew if I made any kind of clumsy mistake, I could be dead before I knew it. Our own guns were incredibly loud, and it was a relief to get below each time I went to get another shell. During the battle, I just strived to do my duty. I never thought about the emperor or anything like that. I was too busy doing my job. After the battle, next morning, I was on deck when I saw 20 or 30 white men floating in the Java Sea. They were waving, trying to signal us, asking to be rescued. But we couldn't do that, as we'd have to stop and put nets down the side. There might still be enemy submarines about. So that was out of the question. We passed the nearest fellow only a few meters away. It was pitiful to look at them. They were horribly burnt by the sun, all of them, and their faces were bright red.
Wow. Again, I keep saying wow, but I don't know how else to say. And we got another slide of the destroyer he was on, and
Yes,
the quote about curry made me laugh when you sent me the slides.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we could go to the last one then, if you like.
Yeah, there's two on the last page. Yeah.
Oh yes, I'm just going to read the story of Kameji Hori. It's just a kind of a returning home story.
Yep.
I got on the ship to go back to Japan at last. When I arrived at my house, it was after 10 o'clock at night. My family had no idea if I was alive, and they went crazy with joy. My mother said, "We must tell your father that you have come back alive." So at midnight, she took me to the Buddhist shrine, and we prayed to the spirit of my father. Next morning, she told me, "After you went to bed at night, I went into your room and touched your legs. You see, in Japan, we believe a ghost has no legs. So when Mother felt my legs, she was finally convinced I had returned alive. She said that nothing can make her happier than this." Though I was 20 when I went away and was now 25, Mother said I'm 20 again now and can make a fresh start today. Other strange things happened to me after my return from the war. One night I was about to fall asleep when I saw an old lady who lived next door suddenly came into my room, and then she disappeared. I got up and told my mother. The lady next door might have died. My mother said, "Don't say such a thing." But then a few hours later, the family next door came to my house and told us that their grandmother had died. My mother said these strange things happened to me because my body was back at home, but my spirit was still at war.
Again, very revealing. Yeah.
Yeah. That's the list. Oh yes, I've read Kawate. That's my list.
Brilliant stuff. So we've got a couple of questions for you, Peter. I mean, I've got some thoughts. I'm still trying to process my thoughts. That last extract you read there gives us a bit of an idea, but Alex Parker is saying, how were the veterans welcomed back to a beaten post-war Japan? You said at the beginning about the fact they didn't admit if they'd been captured, but was there a general reaction to them coming back, or did it vary again in what you spoke to with the gentleman?
Who was it? One of the fighter pilots. Who was it? Harada, that we saw, the first pilot we saw. He said he was very poorly treated by the civilians. He had a bit of a rant about how we fought for these people, and as soon as the war's over and we lost it, they forgot all about us and they treated us like rubbish. And Japanese employers wouldn't employ a professional officer like him because the occupation force often wanted to know what these people were up to. The occupation force were looking for war criminals and witnesses to war crimes, and so Harada found it very difficult to find a job, and so people wouldn't employ him. He couldn't even get a job as a night watchman. He tried all kinds of things, but then things calmed down after a few years, and the town said to him that now there's an influx of people moving into Nagoya, so that he should open a kindergarten. And he said, "Oh no, look, a man like me, I've killed people in the war. I'm not the kind of guy who should be opening a kindergarten." And the sort of citizens committee said to him, no, you're exactly the kind of person to teach the kids about how not to make that mistake again. And he said, so I did. I opened a kindergarten, and it was the best decision I ever made.
That again, that's extraordinary. A kindergarten. I wasn't expecting that twist in the tale there, and it's brought up when you said that. Another question I want to ask is that we know with German veterans there was a lot of times they would try and make the distinction of no, I was in the Luftwaffe, I wasn't the SS, or I was in the here, I wasn't part. Did the Japanese veterans you spoke to kind of make distinctions about the kind of no, I wasn't in that fanatical lot? Did they have that same way of referring to the different branches?
I never met anybody from the Kempi Tai, their military police. No, not that I came across. No, I don't think so. No, people would deny this. One person, I think, participated in the Toll Plantation massacre of 200 Australian prisoners in New Britain in 1942, but he denied that. But then he sort of forgot what he was saying in the conversation, and I think he implicated himself.
Okay. Another question from Magister. Did you ever interview any Japanese submariners?
No, sorry. No, I couldn't. For the time I realised that there were gaps and I needed to find a submariner and a few other bits and pieces, I couldn't find one.
So, bringing it back to the fact you took some of these interviews, 40 years ago now, and the book is relatively recent. And I'll hold it up there again. And folks they've already said they're going to go out and buy the book, and there's obviously a lot more in the book there. But I told myself if I were to go back in time and interview the veterans again, I would do it differently. Other than interviewing more of them, are there things you would do differently if you go back now and be back there in 1984 and start speaking to them again?
Oh, I think I don't know if I said to you before that. Yeah, I would shut my mouth a lot more. I would ask a question and just let them roll. That was a big mistake I made. Like if I knew something if they said something and I could add to it, I would sort of blurt it out and say no. The first battalion was on the left flank, not the right flank. And I just I listen to myself in those interviews now and I cringe. So
yeah, I've been there, done that.
Yeah, a little bit quiet.
And maybe you'd have possibly found out more about some of the darker side of things if you let people talk. I mean, I was saying to you before we went live, I interviewed a German veteran years ago. I say interview, that implies it was much more formal than it was. It was an occasion in Normandy, and this veteran was there. And I spoke to him at length about where he was with his particular gun battery behind Utah Beach, what type of guns they had, etc., etc., etc. And it had gone very well. Then I said, to end the interview, I would like to ask you about what you recall, or were you aware of these American paratroopers who were not just killed in the gun battle, they were hanging in trees and they were mutilated. And suddenly he changed his story. He said, when I said I was in the gun battery, I had been there, but on June the 6th, I was actually at the forward observation position down the beach. I wasn't at the gun battery. And he completely, 180 degrees, he changed his story. And I wish I could go back, and I don't know how I would have done it differently, but he just basically brought it to an end and changed the subject. And I thought there might have been a way of getting him to reveal something about. I wasn't accusing him of anything. I was simply asking him of what he knew about it, and that's it didn't go very well. It didn't end very well. And I'm going back to you interviewing the Japanese veterans. There are, as an Australian, there's massive elephants in the room about this subject. What about the guys who refused to be interviewed? Did you ever find out what their reasons were for not being interviewed?
No, because other Japanese would protect them.
Right.
You wouldn't get a straight answer. A person would come and tell me, no, Mr. Sato doesn't want to do an interview, thank you very much. And you would say, oh, why is that? And they'd say, oh, he's feeling a bit sick this week, or he's got to go and see his family, or something. And in Japanese culture, you're supposed to pick up that and not to inquire further. You know it's a lie. They know it's a lie, but everyone understands a useful little lie. He's not going to see you, but he's not going to tell you why he's not going to see you.
Like a diplomatic game going on, yeah. Another question, I don't know whether you'll be able to answer, not from Jim, is saying, is there a truth to the Midway veterans and wounded being treated like prisoners in Japan after the battle? I don't think I'd ever heard that one. Is that something you're familiar with?
No, I've never heard of that. I don't think it's true. I don't think it's true, but that's my impression. Not so.
Okay, and then before we end things, any kind of general comments you want to make about the speak of these Japanese veterans, or any consistencies or irregularities between them? Again, I mean, my reaction to this is that it seems in many ways they're just like interviewing veterans from other countries. But anything else more general about speaking to these guys?
my first impression was from my father's generation, the Australian soldiers who fought the Japanese, and they had nothing good to say about them. And they said they were cannibals, and they said they beat prisoners, and they did all kinds of bad things. And I discovered in interviewing that some of that is certainly true, but there were an awful lot of Japanese who had nothing to do with that. They didn't. They weren't cannibals. They didn't even see. They didn't see a prisoner such that they couldn't mistreat him. They were just ordinary soldiers, sailors, and airmen. And so that shifted my view from thinking there was something dodgy about all of them. As a child, that's what I thought.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've talked about this on the channel before, but we have collectively we've made the understanding that there could be good Germans within the Nazi ideology. I don't think we've really made that leap with the Japanese in World War II. We tend to still all paint them with that same brush as all being part of this tyrannical regime. And again, I'm not defending the regime, and I'm not saying that it wasn't the majority, but it would be wrong to assume that every single person was behind it fully. And I think what you've done today has revealed there is a different side to these gentlemen. So there we are. We will end things there because it's time for you to go and have a nightcap. Time for me to get on with the rest of the day. Folks, I urge you to go out and get the book. I'll hold it up again. Japan's Pacific War, Peter Williams. Links are in the description below, or you can buy it from your favorite bookstore. I'm back on Monday, another early show, or depending where you are in the world. We've got an interview with a chap who wrote a book about a British First World War veteran who was spying for the Japanese, because next week is Spies, Secrets and Subterfuge on World War II TV. So, Peter, been great talking to you. Folks, thank you for your questions. This is Paul Woodhouse for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your weekend. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Cool.